is melody? What good is music if it ain't possessing something sweet? Now it ain't the melody and it ain't the music. There's something else that makes this tune complete. Yes, it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. Well, it don't mean a thing. All you got to do is sing. It makes no difference if it's sweet or hot. Just give that rhythm everything you got. Yes, don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. It don't mean a thing.
Hello, everybody. How is everyone? I'm pretty good. As you can see, the hair's getting very long, but I'm pretty good. Very excited to speak with everyone today about what we've read. I know I gave us 2 weeks, and I know I said we were going to do a 2-hour live today, but I really feel like we should take the time in between times to really let what we talk about seep in, to let it influence the following week, and to let it drive forward. That's part of the reason why I was like, I think we should just talk about the next 50 pages. I think we should keep it to its original plan where we talk about 50 pages at a time. I'm suffering from a cold, and this pandemic, it caused everyone fear. Yeah. I had that freak out a couple weeks ago now, a week ago. I got sick. I woke up sick, and I was like, I'll tell you the song in a minute. I actually got tested for, COVID and everything. I'm good, I'm clean. But yeah. The name of the song is "It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing" by Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. It's pretty cool. I actually used to listen to it a lot in high school. Where did we talk up to last time? Amy Lumsden. We talked up to page 50, and today we're going to talk up to page 98. Up to chapter 7, Racial Triggers for White People, which means the last chapter we will speak about is anti-blackness. There's a lot to talk about in the next 50 pages. Some of it, I hope we all feel, was like a reiteration or a further deepening a concept she brought up in the first 50 pages. So I think that's cool. I do feel that her repetition is a tool to constantly re-ingrain, very similarly to what our own racial understandings, similar to the way our own racial understandings were ingrained in us by repetition, both subconscious and conscious, both not understandable and understandable. So I like that we're gonna do it slower. I hope that's cool with everyone. Annie Hansen, was I so busy watching the DNC and the RNC? Did I watch it? You mean, did I watch the Democrats put on a very impressive, connected convention where, although no real plans were laid out necessarily, the whole foundation of what it seems the DNC wants and has been pushing is this idea that they are connected to us as a population. And they understand that we are at a very, very critical time. The RNC, I feel like I could have just been watching SNL and got the same messages. There was no truth. It was a terrible, terrible violation of the Hatch Act. We're not going to talk about the RNC just because, it was absurd. It was absolutely absurd in every facet of what that word can mean. We, as a book club, I hope, have read enough dystopian literature to understand the consequences of a supposed democratic ruler who promotes nepotism and the growth of his own family over the growth of a nation, who promotes a singular ideology rather than one that includes most Americans. We know the history of what happens when people like that are allowed to continue without any sort of obstacle. And we've seen examples of that in history. So I think it was a very dangerous thing to watch unfold. We're not going to talk about it. We've got a lot of other things to talk about today. You haven't finished yet either. That's okay. That's okay. If you haven't finished, that's actually even better. One of the reasons why I decided to break it down is because reading 50 pages of this book isn't like reading 50 pages of a fantasy novel that we've read or something more narrative that allows the story to continue to build. This is a deconstruction of something we thought was clear to see. So every time we take steps further into it, we're not only learning a new concept, we're actively unlearning the systemically ingrained in us things we've been taught. So that's why if you're feeling that this reading is harder to get through 20 pages than any other book, it's because it is. It's because it's not only bringing in new information and new ways in which we can perceive things, it's also actively deconstructing all of the things that we've already thought to be true or were taught to just blindly accept. And that's why I really wanted to make sure that with reading this, we don't rush it. We don't rush our understanding and breakdown of this. That we take the time to allow it to really sink into the roots and take up space where other ideas and thoughts were pushed down before, that maybe we didn't do on purpose. So I hope everyone feels the same way. And if not, please express that. Talk to me about why. And let's let that be a learning moment for everyone. I hope everyone's excited. So yeah, glad I tested negative too. I'm catching up. Louis Armstrong. It's good I wasn't able to finish the book. Really struggled reading the middle section. That's okay. I hope that the next section of 50 pages, if you want, since there won't be as much pressure, I apologize. You'll be able to go back and reread or read through in the end of a chapter, maybe that last paragraph that often kind of breaks down what we've learned in a very concise way, will illuminate what you've just read, and you can go back and read it again. So we'll see. We'll see. Finished the book, skipped the meeting for reading. It was worth it. Awesome. Scrolling down. Yes, DNC was giving hope. RNC, yes. I refused to watch the RNC KKK rally. I only wanted to watch it so that when I talk to certain people that we all know that might agree with them, I could actively use all of the things I think were untrue and know to be untrue based on actual scientific fact and research. I could use that against them. Yeah, it was the same. It was the same every day. I do not want to speak in a way that diminishes the idea that people that share those beliefs, I do not want them to feel unsafe or unwelcome in this space. I want anyone that agrees or disagrees with that to understand it is, at a certain point, and I've decided this for myself, there is a moral culpability, and no, that's not the right word. There is a moral, as you can see, I'm having difficulty trying to stay neutral in a situation that I personally believe is no longer a political discussion. It's a moral discussion, and it's a discussion about where you place your priorities. Are they in humanity or are they in financial gains? And is your identity based on the oppression of other people? I think it's that simple, and I've taken steps to actively discontinue my support for people that at this point are taking a moral stance I cannot agree with. I can discuss that with anyone, but I don't want it to become about that. But yes, now that I'm just going back through, you can see that I was very affected by this. Some of what I saw in the news just left me dumbstruck. Yes, try to tell people Trump was, oh no, if Biden wins, I'm applying for citizenship. I literally feel my brain cells dying when the orange man opens his mouth. to Alberto, the book needs a lot more time and concentration than the fiction books we've read so far. Thank you, Jordana. I'm glad we agree with that. And that's why I was like, when I was doing my reading and I had said, we're going to finish it, I was finding myself taking more and more time rereading passages and saying, okay, I'm not going to be able to do that. It wouldn't be the due time. And it would also be a continuation of something this book talks about, and that is the brushing over of these very deeply ingrained topics. It's almost like we should go together a page at a time to really discuss, talk about, flesh out these things. And questions, mainly. I wanted to read it carefully and with full concentration to absorb information, so that's why I'm taking a lot of time. Yes, and I feel the same way. Definitely feels like the present day is falling into dystopia. This book takes a lot of effort. I'm glad you slowed us down. No, thank you. I agree. Needs a lot of concentration to read. I'm having to read in English, not available in my language, so I read a little slower. Exactly. The book needs a lot more time just because of the complicated vocabulary. Yes, have a headache. Sorry, I'm not very active, but I'm here. Maddie, you take your time. You just listen. You're good. I'll do more reading out loud. I underlined many paragraphs. I underlined a lot of things that I was like, okay, obvious before. Here's a way to describe that feeling. I've noticed I was highlighting certain sections that I'm like, ooh, someone's used this argument against me before, and here's the description as to why it doesn't work on every level. Were we supposed to finish it? I haven't finished it. At least, yes, we were supposed to finish it. I did make that assumption that we were going to. But upon reading, I discovered for my own personal growth, I still wanted to break down our conversation. So, if you finished it, great. You don't have to finish reading for next week. But that does mean you have a further vocabulary to discuss what we're going to discuss. We're only going to discuss through the chapter of anti-blackness. We're not going to go forward. But, yes, cool. It's best to have all the information, hence watch both. It's always important to watch both. You can't have an active argument if you didn't hear what the other side said. If it's all hearsay, it's further going into what I think is the big problem, where people are only listening to one news source and getting all their information from it. There are literal facts you can just listen to when you know. Like, one guy I met at a golf course tried to tell me, he tried to use the same facts that President Trump used on the Axios report that was done by an Australian reporter that really kind of shut him down because those facts were, while relevant, completely inaccurate to the situation going on in the United States and only beneficial to one viewpoint, not to the actual truth. So when this guy brought up these viewpoints, I was like, first of all, those are the same bullshit points the president is using. Second of all, that's just Fox News polling points. And if you said something that was directly from CNN, I would call it out the same. I would say that is a completely biased perspective that does nothing to actually illuminate or fix a problem. It only sheds light on where you could possibly be correct. Therefore, an inaccurate and bullshit tool to use. If it can be, like, the things you need to be interested in are the absolute facts and truth. And they are in the middle, but it requires a complete perspective, not just a singular viewpoint, which is what books offer. Back to the book club. This book is really eye-opening. It helped me to understand my place and my responsibility in the system. Yes, the book was the one lesson I never knew I needed. Lorena, I know what you mean. I thought I was quite an avid reader, but it took me time to understand some of it. Yes, that's what we have to do as we learn and grow. Hear what those people have to say and try to understand why they feel that way. Exacto. It's funny to me how Americans use the term freedom as all good, while unlimited freedom also means people have the freedom to do you harm, yet they call freedom every chance they can. And that's the thing that's interesting, and we're finding out with this book. It's the conditional freedom that's allowed. A white person has the right to carry and bear arms, and to publicly display those arms without threat of police, as we saw with this disgusting domestic terrorist, Kyle Rittenhouse. But God forbid we look at the history of the Black Panther Party and recognize that they were just Americans grouping together, using their own constitutionally given rights to protect their communities. And when American people saw the Black Panthers as a threat to this, when white people saw them as a threat, you see what happens to Black Panthers with help of the FBI. And this is all facts. You can look this up. But yes, this double standard that's existing that this book is pointing out and giving us a vocabulary with which to speak about, to talk about it, to break it down. And that's why this book, I think, we really need to be good at diving in, so we can have a vocabulary to now understand, right? We have this vocabulary, white solidarity. and white fragility, and how white fragility is all based on these pillars that we all unknowingly support and continue unless we can define and break down how they exist. And through their description of how they exist, they become real and tangible and able to be deconstructed. Are we still all on the same page? Okay. I have to say, you look great with that hairstyle. Oh my God, stop. Identity based on the oppression of other people. Well said. This book is way too important for us to rush to talk. Thank you for agreeing. I was underlining so much stuff that it could be useful in the future. I didn't even notice. Yes, I've been living white fragility both in discussions I'm having with people and in the questions I'm pointing out myself. I struggle with this book because I agree and disagree with a lot. And that's literally the whole point. If you read this book and didn't feel directly confronted, you didn't feel like it was questioning things, it means you're not actively partaking in the conversation. This book, I think, is to directly approach every person who ever perceives themselves as other or a part of this conversation and break down how we are all actively a part of building this. And that's why I felt, again, like it was important to start here. Because it's giving us this vocabulary. It's giving this understanding from someone who's waking up or had the time to wake up and has watched a bunch of other white people start to have that confrontation. And like, when we start to read So You Want to Talk About Race, this book will further illuminate itself as, unfortunately, because of white fragility, a good starting point for white fragility. It's an interesting thing, but I'm really glad that that's how you felt, because that's exactly the point. I underlined and notated margins of this book so much more than any other book ever. Awesome. I made so many notes in this book compared to my normal, very thought-provoking. My friend saw the book and wondered how I could read anything considering all the posted notes sticking out everywhere. That's awesome. You need to get the whole story rather than part of it. Get the whole picture to fully understand the situation as best you can. Only through understanding can we really change. And that's what this whole book club is about. Only through understanding can we actively change. Like, you don't just change because, you change because you want to. And then because of that, you learn. And then from the learning, you unlearn. And then from that unlearning, you reconstruct what you've deconstructed. And then you might be able to grow. Right? It's a process. And that's what this book is talking about. So I told my parents my mom will not read it because of our talk. Awesome. I have a really cool aunt, Aunt Susanna. I don't know if she's watching, but maybe she'll watch later. She was an aunt that is an artist and pushes forward ideas. So I was like, oh, she's someone that I think would benefit from this book. And someone that I think would actively take what she learns from this book and maybe share it with people. So yeah, I was like, this is a perfect book for you to read. Why don't you join the book club? And if not, it'll be online. You can watch them. And then, so yes, this is also part of our goal, is not only taking in the knowledge for ourselves, it's actively seeing where we can push it for other people and give it and pass it on. I've discussed about this book with my family to understand their point of view and to take the questions that this book generated in me. It's inspiring because I feel like I can do something about it. I'm horrified around the part about the medical students and residents that believe that black people felt this pain. That comes from the deeply racialized history of medicine in the United States. And it's something that people are still taught subconsciously or consciously. And it's actually the Kender, that entire understanding of the difference and the differences in the way that black people and people of color are treated in the world of medicine. When we look at infant mortality rates with black mothers versus white mothers, it's ridiculous when they're happening in the same hospitals. That's a whole other subject that you should do more research into, everybody, and further familiarize yourself with the ways in which medicine is even incredibly biased because of its racialized history. I think that the book will talk more about that, and so You Want to Talk About Race does as well. But that's a really cool question, and if anyone wants to do further research on that, I suggest you do. It's crazy to me that the American belief that other countries don't have freedom due to things like hate speech laws. It's one of the things I think we're all reckoning with, and I'm sure people from other countries in our book club are seeing actively in the United States right now, is that the U.S. is, at this current point in time, being confronted with the understanding that being told you were the best was always a lie. At one point in history, a very brief point in history, what you were told about the U.S. was true, actually for a very specific part of the population, for the white man. But the lie is that it was true for anyone that could exist within the freedom of the United States. That was the lie. The truth was for it was this small population, and that lie funneled down. And this was like the 40s and 50s to the 60s. And that was when we were seeing income inequality actually it was not that it wasn't a thing, but we can talk about that part of economics later. But yeah, there was a period of time where that lie might have been true for white dudes. And then in the 70s, 1971, that stopped happening. But anyway, the Black Panthers were the only time the NRA called for gun control. Because the NRA doesn't believe that everyone in America has the right to bear arms. And it's inherent in all of the policies that they continue to perpetuate and use their lobbyists for. It's bullshit. As an immigrant, looking at some of the facts and the freedoms is really eye-opening. There's a lot of media portraying things a certain way, especially if you're not grown up in the environment. Yes. You can find it hard to understand. Yes. Another valid point to stress here is that the author talks about the American perspective, but as she points, it can be applied to several other countries. Yes. Are we going to read more books about the BLM movement? Sorry, I must have missed something. Yes, but we're starting from an understanding in the foundation of this. Like, we're not going to start at the top, the most recent block on this civil rights understanding. Like, we have to start at the foundation. And in order to start the foundation, we have to start with the building blocks that make up the foundation. And then when we find out that all those building blocks are made up of this one singular idea, this binary necessity, and this inability to even talk about what those building blocks are made up of, right? Then we can move to the different movements that help perpetuate it. But yes, Wicked Mara, that's what dope. The question that the book generates is the biggest lessons that we can learn, I think. Because the race and privileges are more extended that we think every day. Yes. Reading this has definitely made me more aware of what I'm saying, and I'm trying to be more aware so I don't unknowingly hurt anyone's feelings, particularly people of color. Yeah, and that's the thing. It's everything is awareness. It's saying, oh, I used to think this way. Wow. And now that I can even ask these questions, what questions can now be considered that before weren't even on the radar? But once I've entered this other sphere of thought and understanding, it's like it's like they've lifted one film of blindness over it, and you're like, oh God, it's so much clearer, but the prescription's I'm never going to see 100% clearly. So how many more films am I going to be able to peel off to see the truth? And hopefully the goal is to eventually not have that. I don't know if that'll be something we can do in our lifetime, but we're going to work our fucking hardest. Excuse my language. I recognize myself in many of her examples without knowing my behavior could be problematic. Now I understand better, it can change and grow. Yes, and then I think one of the first things she does is allow us to ask the question, well, I've done that, or I've thought that. Am I? Can I? Could? All of those things that all start from that first spark of like, ooh, I recognize myself in this. I'm sorry, it's not in Portuguese yet. Though I do live in the States, it's something that deeply puzzles me, and knowing more helps me understand the struggles of others. Yes. Quintessence. That's cool. The good thing about this book is that the author might be talking about America's statistics and events, but it happens all around the world. Yes. I've been talking to many people about racism in this book, and surprisingly, I know a lot of people who believe racism in Germany is over. Nope. Just go to the makeup section in the store. And that's, like, we talk in the book, she talks about that idea that when racism came to the forefront of understanding in America, it was during the 60s, specifically during the civil rights movement, where many people were for the first time seeing that their simple belief that there were some races superior to others allowed other people to act in the violent, aggressive way we saw televised during the civil rights movement. Dogs, fire hydrant, and fire hoses being used against women and children, and people of color with this intense hatred, the famed image of the person screaming at these different things. I mean, when you see the desegregation of schools in the United States, Brown versus the Board of Education. Like, you know, when you start to see that integration, and you see the intense hatred against it, you're like, oh my gosh, like that's what people thought racism was. And that's why we saw a shift from that. People got smarter with it. They were like, oh, well, I'm not racist. I don't actively, like, discriminate through violence. No, but now, because of that, it's become the scapegoat for racism. Like, now, you don't do that, you're not racist. When really, having other beliefs like we're learning about, reading about, the way neighborhoods are built, the way we think about schools and safer places, and diversity in the workplace, like all of the things that it's now seeped into because it had to get smarter. Racism did. I think it's pretty cool that we're reading about this and we're in a group where we can learn. John Oliver did a piece on bias in medicine, so I highly recommend checking that out if you want to learn more about it. Thank you, Lise. That's true. I would check that out. I laughed out loud when the RNC said Trump charmed German chancellor. Yeah, right. Struggling with the book, making me feel I can't feel things due to white privilege, while I recognize a deep connection through my experience with anti-Semitism, what I feel versus need to hear and learn. Right. And I think one of the other things that society continually does is like support where it affects us but doesn't, and support where we can start to see ourselves as not part of the problem. And I think that isn't helpful, you know? There is no freedom, not when it only benefits the white supremacy. Yes. Is it hard to read? I would love the subject, but you need to have like a certain age to completely get everything. Does it teach me more about America as some from Europe? I think we can talk about that as a group. What do we feel so far? Everyone, for Ghost Rockaroon, do we think that for people that are American, how do you feel? For people that aren't American, how do you feel it's influencing your viewpoints of your respective countries or continent? I think for me as an American, it's breaking down the more subtle ways that I participate in racism without my awareness. And that racism doesn't just stick to the structure within the United States. It sticks to the idea that white is the norm in the world. And that when something is no longer as white, it loses its value, it loses its safety, it loses its... And that's something that this book brings up, and all the ways in which society props up these ideas and tears down the others. That's my understanding. So if anyone else wants to chip in, I think that'd be great. I'll read it out loud. I definitely, we are quintessence. We are questioning our own thoughts in our own country and everything we are taught as kids. This happens everywhere. Awesome. I definitely agree with what D'Angelo said about racism being present globally. I can't say that I identify as white being from India, but I do still have more privilege than people of color. Do you think that America's obsession with guns also ties into white fragility? Absolutely. Absolutely. Because America's obsession with guns is an obsession with white people having guns, not everybody having guns. And I think nothing has made that more clear than the media's interpretation of the domestic white supremacist terrorist that is Kyle Rittenhouse. This guy showed up to a protest from a different state with an AR assault rifle. What were the intentions there? Well, we're not going to get talking about that yet. We're going to read about that and talk about that from a different perspective. Because I need to, anyway, there's more to learn, but yes. Those people interested in the German perspective, exit racism, Deutschland, Schwartz, loads more touch on it. Sorry I couldn't pronounce a lot of that, but there's a really cool comment here for everyone. It makes you realize that it's everywhere, and I often thought some issues weren't applying to me, but now I realize they do. Yes. And I think that's one of the things that white fragility allows us. It allows us to have an individualistic, oh, well, that doesn't really apply to me because I don't perpetuate that. That doesn't apply to me. And us having the allowance to say we are other further perpetuates the strength and growth of that other idea. In my country, we have a different kind of racism. In people's eyes, we divided East and West. People who live in the East, different racial type, and people who live in the West don't live in the East. It happens. It's scary to recognize yourself in something you didn't realize was harmful. It makes you pause. And quintessence, if I may say, I think that's the essence of like a good actor. is they take people that we find to be difficult to identify with, and they make them human for us, so that we realize that we actually identify with that villain in a way that we never thought we could or would, because we labeled them as bad instead of as human. And I think that's when you get really good work and incredible art, when someone is able to show us the humanity in someone. And that's what's really dangerous. We're going to read The Fire next time by James Baldwin for season 4. Yes, we are. So true. This book made me feel uncomfortable sometimes, but I think it's exactly what it's meant to do. Accurate example, Alberto. It's literally like we live in a blind society. Her chapter on the good in the binary was really eye-opening. Yes, and so very true. The term racism has such a negative connotation that being accused of it is like being accused of murder. So naturally, the first response is to deny it. And that's one of the biggest things I've taken away from this next 50 pages, is that she's like, we first have to understand that racism isn't this thing that makes you the image of the screaming white person from the South from 1961. No, racism is a cultural structure that is inherent in the way our society is built. And even denying it exists further perpetuates it. You know? So in order for us to really break it down, we have to actively understand that against our fault and will, we were indoctrinated into a society that perpetuates us at every possible turn. And if we really want to do the work to break it down, we have to recognize that it exists. We have to recognize that we have a place in it. And only then, when we have a firm grasp of these things, can we actively tear them down. We can't do it when we have no hands in the pot. We can't do it when our hands are clean. You know, we have to recognize our place in using those colors to paint the world. And only then can we change those colors, manipulate them, and learn from them, and grow from them, and maybe even make more colors that are more beneficial. I think that's really important to note. D'Angelo makes it clear that we should be asking questions about and reflecting on our own behavior and how we can move forward and become more conscious and aware. And I think that's the biggest thing, is instead of saying, well, that's not me, it's always asking, well, how do I perpetuate that thought? How, if there is a way I could, how would I? And now, putting it in that and immediately taking that responsibility, then we can say, well, I don't do this, but I do this, and that benefits this, so I can stop doing this. You know? In Cold Blood is next. That is our next book. We'll talk about next books at the end of this, so don't worry about it. Racism is like murder. The concept exists, but someone has to commit it in order for it to happen. Lynn, and that's what we're learning is not true. Racism doesn't have to be actively committed for it to be perpetuated. What we're reading in our book is that racism exists, and our denial of it perpetuates it. Our denial that we take part in it further perpetuates it by diminishing the idea that it's there. So in that, you said like racism, like murder, the concept exists, but someone has to commit it. I don't agree with that. I think that murder is an act to commit murder, whereas racism is a structure, which means whether or not we actively perpetuate it, in denying it, that structure continues to uphold and exist. And someone has to commit murder. And what we've learned is that, yes, there is a case where someone commits a discriminatory act based on their prejudice. And because they are of the ruling power of people, meaning they come from the majority, the structure in the power they have, that is racism. But you can have a discriminatory act that is based on a prejudice from a person that's not in the racial hierarchy, and that's different. But racism stands whether or not we actively pursue it, and that's what this book is reading, and that's what we're learning in this book. Would anyone else like to comment on that? And Lynn, if you'd like to continue this idea that you had, and we could continue to deconstruct it together and break down what we've learned in the book and how we can apply it to this idea, and how we've learned that this comment that someone has to commit the act of racism to be racist. We actively learn that that's one of the biggest things perpetuating racism, is that people feel exempt from committing specific acts, when actually just their existence in the system without denying it, without questioning it, perpetuates racism. So if anyone else would like to use examples from the book to help Lynn see what we've broken down and read so far, that would be great. Please put them down, and Lynn, I hope you stay with us and keep reading. I find this interesting to discuss with my friend from South Africa, since the numbers are reversed there. Listening to her opinions are somewhat scary to me at first. And South Africa has a very, well, similar but different racial history, and the way that even it's structured and built as neighborhoods and whatnot is very different. So that if you want to continue letting us know the responses and questions you're having with your friend, and that opportunity to learn and grow, I would love to hear more about that.
Apartheid just ended in 1993.
Yeah. It's a different world in that sense. The chapter about good and binary was very interesting. Yes. I love that D'Angelo talks about the difference between prejudice, discrimination, and racism. And that's one of the biggest things we have to talk about when addressing this idea. Because that's what I've had to use when I talk to people. I'm like, well, what you're specifically discussing is discrimination, which is an act. Prejudice is a belief in how you see the world. And how you see the world influences how you act. So prejudice and discrimination are always tied together. Now, when the person committing that discriminatory act, because of their prejudice, has the dominant social power, the institutional authority, that's when it becomes racism. And I love that we broke that down. And I love that we had to learn that actively. Because I'll tell you, when I was in school, we learned the definitions. But then they showed pictures of people from the 60s, and they said, look at those racists discriminating. They didn't say that when you are actively choosing to go around a certain street or a neighborhood or a place, you're discriminating based on prejudice. And they didn't break it down to that level. And that's what we're doing. We're making sure that that's where we start. When I was going through immigration, I actually had someone say, you won't have many issues because you're white. It's a terrifying statement, and it's true. And that's one of the things that I've had to confront is white passing. White passing is dangerous because for a lot of reasons, but I think one is it allows the person to believe they are participating in and passing until they're denied that. And it's it's an interesting thing. This dichotomy is problematic. We should be more aware of nuances. Yes. It was a bit harder to relate to the areas you live in, school groups, etc., but it was good read and could relate to the UK. I believe it could, very much so, certain things. It's fascinating. It mentions Columbus and the Indian when he discovered America. The only difference depends really on lighter skin. It's insane. The book applied to every country because white fragility and racism exists everywhere around the world, especially in Western culture because a lot of us were colonized nations. So it's inherent in the treatment of all of these terrible things were going on, and they needed a way to document and say, well, what we're doing is right because we're superior. So we have the right to do this and to treat people this poorly. And it doesn't conflict at all with our Christian understanding and ideology. Because although God says treat everyone the same, he made us better. Yeah, let's run with that, because that's the only thing that can make any of this make sense. I feel like even though the author's talking about American specific, this applies everywhere. Every topic makes us remember or realize we have heard this before. Exactly. I don't know if it's out of context or not, but I had a fight with my dad because he doesn't want me to put a BLM pin on my bag because he says that black people aren't the only ones marginalized. That if a house is on fire, you don't think about the other houses surrounding it and say, but the other houses matter. But he still wouldn't understand. Yes, we had a similar conversation. And yeah, I use I think that's interesting. But I think one of the arguments you can make is like when we look at the actual facts of the system, we have to say that if we truly believe that all lives should matter and all marginalized groups should have equal representation, then we have to start with saying, well, if we really believe that, it means black lives have to matter in a system where they are constantly shown in every facet that they don't. So if we really believe this one statement, we have to fight for black lives to matter. We have to fight for trans lives to matter. We have to fight for indigenous lives to matter. Because if not, if we're saying all lives matter, but we're not actively fighting for those lives to matter, it means that that statement at the top is bullshit. Sorry. I recognize it's difficult to teach someone that who doesn't have that understanding, but keep using those ideologies, keep using those things. Like if one house is on fire and it's burning down, we don't say, well, all of the houses need to be looked at. Have the firefighters go to every one. No, we say, let's deal with the house that's on fire first. And then so you're right in that. I think we should discuss more ways as a book club that we think we can help teach this lesson. Anyone else have any other ideas? I think this is a good idea. Do I believe civilians should be allowed to have guns? That is not a topic we will discuss today, for many reasons. I will say this. I am vehemently opposed to anyone who pushes forward the idea that blue lives matter. That is the biggest cop-out bullshit I've ever heard. When you make a choice to pursue a career, you take upon you all of the inherent dangers that that career offers. And knowingly, and that's what the sacrifice is, and it's a wonderful thing. It's not a sacrifice if you keep reminding people why you're doing a good thing. Then it becomes something to just make yourself look good, and it becomes bullshit. A blue life is someone who can take a badge off, put the uniform away, and no one knows what the hell they do. That is just absolutely abhorrent to me, and it shows a clear choice in priorities, ones that benefits that purports your oppression of other people over the priorities of actual humanity. If you say you want to be a blue life to help people, but then say blue lives matter, it means you're caught in your own hypocrisy, and I do not support you or that belief. Now, whether or not civilians should carry guns, that's a conversation for another time. We can have that conversation after we do some awesome reading and educating ourselves about it so that we're all in the same boat. Because I even right now would say that I'm undereducated on that subject. But that's a very good question. I think people can tell where I stand, but I would like us to read before we talk about that. Next question. Being from Hawaii, it's interesting to see racism. The islands are mostly Asian and Polynesian. Here I feel like we make fun of Caucasian people here. And that's interesting, but it's like that. Yeah, I can see that. I heard about that. He just killed people, but the police did nothing because he was white. They did nothing. Here in France, racism against Muslims, most of all, in the end, it's the same as in the U.S. What we're seeing is this what happens when the status quo is being questioned, altered, changed. There's an opposition to that. And it all stems from a fear, lack of understanding, and what was told to us and taught to us structurally. When we look at the way Muslims in the Western world are represented in film, television, and by the media, it is never in the most beneficial light. And unfortunately, whether or not we want to believe it, we have to understand that those biases constantly put to us seep into our understanding. And the fact that many of us, hearing me say this, agree, well, yeah, they're not represented, means we're recognizing that there is a change and there is a difference in the way that they're spoken about and represented. And that's one of the first steps. But yeah, interesting. Andy, we can have a guns conversation later. Because that's a whole other topic that I'm not educated enough to speak about. Because I know what I was taught to think. I know what I personally believe. But I don't know what is the most beneficial for all people. What I can tell you is that the current structure and way in which the Second Amendment is spoken about and shown actively in the way that it's responded to by police and whatnot, that Second Amendment is really only a right for certain people and for a certain group of people. And once other people wish to partake in that Second Amendment, then it becomes questioned. And that has to speak to the structure of our society. That was the most informative chapter to me. It was something that I'd never really thought of, but it really explains why white fragility does exist. White supremacy is global. As a white, cis, straight woman born in Sweden, there is nothing not available to me. But that's not the case for Swedish citizens of color. Yes. Yes, it's more to say I'm not racist, or a lot of my friends. It's more than this. It's more than that. It's more than that. Sadly, not everyone understands the difference. Jordana, I'm sorry you're going through that with your dad. I feel like it's a lot more difficult for old generations to open themselves to these thoughts, having been brought up in a society that didn't discuss the issue so openly and make people think about it. And I think what we need to understand is when there is a conversation that is worth pushing, and when there are times to say, you know what, I feel like we're entering territory that is not beneficial for either of us. So why don't I leave you with what we've talked about today, and we can pick this up at another time. But just sit with it. Don't ask all of the questions you want, but to yourself, and then go look them up yourself. And then we can talk further the next time when we're both back in a headspace that's beneficial. Because what I've realized is when we're talking about things, especially things that we believe to be morally right and morally correct, when people deny that, it gets very frustrating. And unfortunately, that frustration can push to anger, which then becomes a direct wall, and you can't teach anyone through anger. And I've learned that, and I am guilty of that. You could ask anyone. I could have a temper sometimes. Maybe some people don't see it. But I could get pretty hot-headed sometimes, especially when I am questioning the intellectual understanding of the person with which I'm speaking. And that is not good of me, and it further puts my points in a position of like, this guy doesn't really get it. So I recognize that in order for me to actually inspire and teach, it requires even further understanding so that I can speak from a calmer place. I'm working on it. So don't think that I have it figured out. You could ask anyone I know. I'm working on it. Right, Tessa? Give the thumbs up. I'm scrolling down. Racism is like an iceberg. We only know information that there's more spoken about. There's a lot more layers and depth. And that's exactly it. The idea that racism is only in a discriminatory act because of someone's race, because of that prejudice. That idea that it's only through that perpetuates the idea that this iceberg can float along without recognizing that it's going to sink every big ship that goes by because of all the inherent bias and everything else that comes with racism. The different wage structures, the difference in the financial world and how people are received by banks and loans, and like every fabric of our society is defined by this iceberg. But we're only allowed to discuss the tip of it? Who does that help? It doesn't help the ship swimming by. And yeah, Anna, that is a great analogy. Amy, thank you for pointing that out. Anna, awesome. I like how the author pointed out that it isn't possible to not judge. We can always keep it light and not affect us, but we always judge. I think there is a specific biological understanding for the belief that we need to judge or take in information. How did we learn to not eat certain things? Well, someone ate it and got really sick or died, and we're like, all right, we know we shouldn't eat those. That is a prejudice that was earned and allowed for the perpetuation of the species to keep growing. Okay, we learned not to eat that or do that. But that same idea does go into other ways in which we navigate the world. It's natural. And then understanding that after a certain point, it's not us that's making the choice, it's society teaching us the choices we can make. That's the rub. That's the power there. Silence is racism too. Absolutely. Silence is fear. It's not enough to be racist, to be not racist, to be anti-racist actively. My South African friend is white, so her opinions are insightful. We have intense arguments about reverse racism since she strongly believes it exists because of the current political situation there. Now, what we learn is that she could say discrimination exists and prejudice exists, but racism has to do with the institutional power and authority that perpetuates it. It is an institutional thing. Prejudice can't exist. And I love the example she gives, how a white person getting called a cracker or some other derogatory term for a white person is bad. And yes, it can be prejudiced from a prejudice idea and discriminatory, but the most it can do is upset that white person's day. Oh, is that so you want to talk about, sorry, Tess and I have been having discussions about, so you want to talk about race, so I'm confusing two books. But in that book she says the most it could do is disrupt that white person's day or ruin a feeling. Whereas the converse, if it's a white person towards a black person, the consequences of calling a black person a racially derogatory term or a slur doesn't just ruin their day. It could end up in the loss of their life. It could end up in imprisonment. It can end up in violence against that person, and the system supports it. And that's why it's so dangerous. And that's why we have to be able to identify the differences so you can validate your South African friend's experiences with prejudice and discrimination, while also illuminating the racism that allows her to be safe in acknowledging that prejudice and discrimination. Was that a good way to put it? Cool. Because I'm not going to lie to you guys, a lot of the time when we're having our discussion, I'm reaffirming everything I've learned and read by speaking it to you, by reading your comments, by taking your comments in and then putting what I think about them on. And that's what we all should be doing. We should all be taking everyone else's words from their mouth, saying them in our own, and saying how, when, if, could, maybe. All of the thoughts, that's how we learn. When we take everything we learn, we put it inward in order to dissect it and then recognize what it gives us. Hello, Tessa, how are you? And Stella, we miss you both. Hi. Anyone else bookmark the crap about colorblind versus color celebrate from chapter 5, or is it just me? Thank you for emphasizing the difference between prejudice and racism. I think it's one of the most important things we learn in the first 50 pages of the book, is that definition. Because, I will tell you, everyone I know that is white brings that up. They bring up the times they were discriminated against, and how they experienced reverse racism. And then I get on my high horse and say, well, your opinion is wholly misinformed. You are extremely uneducated if you believe that you received racism as a white person. And then I get to actually not be condescending and say, well, like, what you experienced was prejudice, and I'm sorry that hurt your feelings. And that discrimination really affected you. And now I want you to use that same understanding, and I want you to take it a step further. And imagine if the system reflected that in every choice. If you couldn't get a bank loan, or if you couldn't attend certain schools, or if you attending certain schools was seen as a gift because of your race, not because of your ability to actually achieve that. Like, when you see it that way, and they experienced that small grain of hurt, but experienced it, you can put it on you can grow that. You know, so you can use words and feelings for your benefit from people. So it's not okay it's a benefit someone to say, yes, recognize that. Now let's see if you can take that feeling and take it out of your own perspective for a second. It's difficult. Take a breath with me, you know? I was once with a friend of mine that's black, and it made me want to throw up the way the cashier treated us so differently. Very nice to me, an asshole to her. Yeah. Page 60 breaks down the numbers. The wealth and power in our country now it rests in the hands of a small population of white people. And one further thing that I believe, T, if I'm talking about, so you want to talk about race again, just let me know, that she talks about is that the idea of white supremacy, how do I put this in a very simple way? How the wealth is in the... I have to think about what I want to say. Sorry, I'll come back to that. Alberto, can you please tell Tessa that the truth about the Harry Caber affair is finally out in Brazil? I watched it, and that it is awesome, and that she's amazing in it.
Oh, cool, I didn't know that.
Yeah, she's very excited, and she didn't know that. She might post something later about to the people in Brazil to check it out. Cause,
I didn't know it was up there.
yeah.
Can you ask her when it came
can you tell us when it came out? And Kel Caesar, if you don't want to do it on this forum, cool. If you just want to tweet Tessa or me, that would be great too. No, it's okay. This book taught me so much more about people's reactions, especially concerning the Black Pete debate here. Can you explain that, please? One interesting question is why it is called political correctness and not social correctness. Our view on race is still largely mostly influenced by politics. Catherine Moser. Yes! And that is true. And the fact that being politically correct has now been politicized should further show you how much the machine works to distance ourselves from racial understanding and to distance ourselves from into this binary good and bad. Because now political correctness is part of the binary good or bad. And it's, and it's just further being divided. And one of the things we have to recognize as a population is that the system always benefits when it divides us. Because the people in power stay in power. If we go back to Sun Tzu in The Art of War, which we might read together, divide and conquer is a thing that is told to people about enemies. Yes, as one giant wall, you can't climb it or break it. But if you get one brick and one brick and one brick, eventually that wall will crumble. Divide and conquer. So what they do is they divide the population, and there's a really cool quote by Noam Chomsky, who's a political philosopher, writer, where he says, like, one of the ways to control people is to create 2 points of communication that are deemed socially acceptable, and then to encourage furious debate between those 2 points. So anything outside of that gets pushed to the outside, and people don't care. And that's what we need to be aware of. Always. All lives matter is a mess since they don't understand the real meaning about BLM. Well, if they really believe all lives matter, then they should really believe and understand BLM. And if they don't, it's their own prejudice and bias that's perpetuating it. And that's what they refuse to confront often when you bring up the fact. They're like, okay, you say all lives matter. We're saying the same thing. We're saying the same thing. So can you help me in making Black Lives Matter so that one day I can hold your hand and we can stand on the middle of Hollywood Boulevard and cry and shout and scream that all lives finally matter. But until Black Lives Matter, all lives don't matter. So what you're saying is either trying to shut me up, trying to close the door, or you don't really agree or believe in that, what you're saying.
I think they don't even realize it's subconscious they're saying White Lives Matter.
Mm-hmm.
They don't even realize it.
Sorry, we have 2 minutes left. I feel that doing this reading this week was extra difficult because this week felt like it was really hard for a lot of us, emotionally, mentally, and physical for some. All right, we have 2 minutes left. Speaking to that, I think that's a good way to end. I apologize if I'm not going to get to read the last few comments, but we only have 1 minute and 32 seconds, so I want to talk to that. Right now, we are going through a very difficult time. And for some of us, it's affecting us more than most. And I want you guys to know, it is always okay to take a breath. I tweeted something about it recently. You can't pour from an empty cup. So you need to constantly making sure that you're taking care of yourself and taking care of who you are. The material we're reading is challenging. It's forcing us to question things, to question ourselves, to look at parts of ourselves and admit to parts of ourselves. Things we never wanted to admit and things that society has always taught us are bad and wrong. And we don't ever want to say we're a part of that. And it's hard work. And for other of us, what we're talking about in this might not be an escape from the world that we're living in. And for people of color, for the Black people in our group, I understand this might be difficult. I thank you for your strength and courage, and I thank you, and I want you to understand, you don't have to be a part of this. You can take time away, you can take a breath, you're allowed, all of your feelings are valid. And I never want you to feel that, well, I have to be a part of us, or anyone else that's feeling those feelings. You can always take time away and come back. You can't pour from an empty cup. So with that, keep questioning, keep learning, keep growing, keep questioning things and continue to be positive forces of changes in your environment. I got it out. Love you guys. See you next week for the finish of the book.